All right, I'd like to now hand over to our Chair of the Day, Philip Endersby, who will come to the podium and take over the meeting. Philip.
Thank you very much, President Catherine. Look, it's a great pleasure of mine today to introduce our guest speaker, Jacob Kane. Jacob, when I look at Jacob's CV there, CEO of Ray White CRE, I go through the various qualifications there, bachelor's degree from Melbourne Uni, MBA from Monash, off to Harvard, now doing a PhD with ANU, and I sort of say to myself, golly gosh, the HECS debt must be such that it just about make you homeless. But let me say there's a couple of things here. Housing in Australia has never been less affordable. Melbourne is rated the 7th least affordable housing market in the world, and Sydney is ranked 2nd. I guess with Jacob, who's on his 2nd term as President of the Real Estate Institute of Victoria, serves on a number of government bodies to do with housing, will really give us a heads up on where we are today, where we're going, and probably where we've gone wrong. So, Jacob, your topic, Mills with Impact, Positive Change. Welcome to the stage.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and sincerest thanks for having me here today. It is indeed an absolute pleasure and a privilege to join you here. As you've just heard, my name is Jacob Kane, and I'm the President of the Real Estate Institute of Victoria. Now, I'm sure for many of you that name is somewhat familiar. You may have a keen awareness of just what it is that we do, or you may have just heard that name in passing. For those of you that aren't aware of what the Real Estate Institute of Victoria, or REIV, is, we are the peak body for the real estate sector here in Victoria. We have a membership base of around 7,000, which comprises both individuals and business members. And the REIV is also part of a national network of real estate peak bodies known as the Real Estate Institutes of Australia. We are the primary representative of the sector with the government, with the opposition and minor parties, advocating for better policies with regards to property and housing in the state. In addition to our advocacy work, we deliver certification and diploma level courses that qualify individuals to work within the real estate industry, as well as offering a broad curriculum of continuing professional development courses. We host major events, including awards and conferences and industry breakfasts and lunches, not unlike the event that we're at today. Beyond that, we're also in the data collection, analysis and research space, and run a forms or contracts platform, which supplies the sector with many of the agreements that keep real estate transactions here in this state happening on a day-to-day basis. As Philip said, the topic of my presentation today is leading with vision, realising positive change in challenging conditions. And I think it's appropriate at this time that I make an admission, and that is that I believe the REIV has failed to lead with vision over the last decade. Now, that's not to say that we haven't had moments of strong, even visionary leadership throughout that period, but we have tended to focus too much on the negative aspects of change within the sector. We've tended to focus too much inwards and to advocate for the sector and represent the sector through that lens. Over the course of the past 18 months, our board and our executive team have sought to correct that trend. In June last year, for the first time in our almost 90-year history, we appointed a female CEO, Kelly Ryan. Now, Kelly joined us from the high-performance world of professional sport and has brought that high-performance culture into our organisation. We sold our traditional headquarters in Camberwell, a building that we'd occupied since the early 80s and throughout that period had never substantively renovated. We purchased a new building in Abbotsford, which we've just moved into, and that has been fitted out to a qualitative and technological level that helps redefine where our organisation sits within this real estate landscape. Late last year, we were able to overhaul our very archaic constitution, a constitution that had withstood multiple efforts by previous boards to update and to meet the modern business and membership operating environment. We've shifted our focus, or as a lot of people are saying nowadays, opened the aperture to recognise that our stakeholders are, in truth, anyone that touches a residential, a commercial or industrial property here in Victoria, which in real terms means everyone in Victoria. Now, that is not an uncomplex group of stakeholders to try and serve, to try and devise policy for. It is a population with diverse needs, with diverse beliefs and tastes. But we all share some things in common. The need to access safe, comfortable and affordable homes. The need to work somewhere that is convenient to get to and pleasant enough to spend 8+ hours a day in. And an overwhelming majority of our stakeholders, the people of Victoria, believe that they can secure theirs and their family's financial future through some form of property ownership. So by shifting our focus to recognise that much larger group of stakeholders that we represent, we've been better able to think about real estate in Victoria as an ecosystem. And like any ecosystem, the health of the overall system is entirely reliant on the health of the disparate parts that compose it. Right now, our property ecosystem here in Victoria and across Australia is very far from healthy. Now, I think it might be technically illegal for me as an REIV representative to get up here and give a presentation without heaps of charts and graphs and whatnot. So strap yourselves in. There's a few ahead of you. That said, I have tried to include graphs and charts that are relatively interesting, hopefully, for you. So the graph that you see on the screen behind you is actually out of date. There has been a subsequent edition of Demographia's International Housing Survey, Affordability Survey, which shows that Melbourne, inauspiciously, has jumped 2 spots on these rankings to be rated the 7th least affordable housing market in the world. You can see that Sydney's there at number 2, and for the first time ever, Adelaide entered the list at 9th on that list. Now, the classification that Demographia awards these 3 cities and anyone on that top 10 list is impossibly unaffordable. It's also worth noting that Melbourne managed to jump those 2 places from 9th to 7th, despite the fact that in the last 12 months, our property prices, our median property prices have decreased around 2%. Now, you might be wondering how it's possible that we've increased our position or improved our position on that least unaffordable housing ranking despite our prices coming down. There are obviously a variety of inflationary factors that contribute to affordability. Demographia considers more than just the pure cost of properties. Amongst other things, it factors in average incomes, related housing costs like taxes and energy costs and the costs of essentials. None of that, however, to my mind, diminishes how startling it is to see Australian cities increasingly dominating these rankings for least affordable housing markets across the world. In Australia, our dwelling prices didn't uniformly decrease last year. In fact, in some capitals, dwelling prices rose dramatically. For instance, both Brisbane and Perth saw incredible double-digit growth in median prices throughout 2024. And Perth is forecast to grow an additional 20% this year. Their growth saw them overtake Melbourne in terms of median price and could see them appear on that list we just saw for most unaffordable cities next year. We can see from the graph on the screen just how rapid and dramatic the rise in property prices has been over the last 5 years. the total value of residential property here in Australia has risen more than 55% in that period. The only other countries around the world that have surpassed that percentage increase have generally done so as a byproduct of hyperinflation. Australia's total residential housing market exceeded $10 trillion for the first time last year. Now, for clarity's sake, we should note that new housing accounts for only a very small percentage of that growth. The overwhelming majority of that growth has come about as a result of existing housing getting more expensive. And we can see that evidenced in this next graph here, which shows that dwelling prices have almost doubled in the last decade and are rapidly approaching the $1 million mark for the average Australian dwelling. The term dwelling includes basically all types of housing: apartments, units, townhouses, and standalone houses. Something to consider in these figures is the typology of new dwellings being constructed. Over the course of the last decade, the number of apartments being constructed has tripled. The ratio of new dwellings built is still 2 to 1 in favour of houses, but the recent trend lines indicate that that ratio could flip within a decade, and we'll begin to see apartments become the dominant dwelling type across the country. That shift will necessarily challenge our traditional notions of the Australian dream with a 3 or 4 bedroom house on a large block at its core. A majority of Australians continue to have a stated preference for houses as against units, apartments and townhouses. However, it is vitally important that Australia transitions to a housing mix with a majority of medium density dwellings. Medium density is townhouses or apartments. Modelling by the OECD has shown that a majority of medium density housing is the only means by which we can accommodate equitably, sustainably, and affordably an ever-growing population. Supply of housing continues to be at the heart of our affordability challenges. While there are many levers that need to be pulled to solve this problem, this is one of the problems where there is actually a silver bullet, and that is simply build more homes. I know that's easier said than done, but with both federal and state governments committing to delivering 1.2 million and 800,000 new homes respectively, and both falling drastically behind those targets within the first 18 months of making those commitments, the question remains, do either of the major parties have the conviction and courage required to genuinely deliver policies that will support the rapid construction of enough homes to house our growing population? In contrast to the residential sector, the commercial market in Australia has enjoyed only modest growth, forecast to reach a total value of around $1.72 trillion this year, which is a rise of around 15% since 2017. The core challenge to commercial real estate remains the changed working habits in a post-COVID world. Vacancy rates in Melbourne CBD office buildings remain stubbornly high as floor space requirements for larger employers have reduced as big chunks of their employee base work either hybridly or entirely from home. That said, the commercial real estate space or sector is leading the charge on energy efficiency and sustainability within the built environment. And that is primarily driven by corporate tenants with an appetite or requirement for higher levels of tenancy comfort, lower operational costs, and mandatory emissions reporting. Now, what we call a balanced market in the rental world is a vacancy rate of around 3%. At that level, generally speaking, there are enough available homes to house the population of renters looking for them. As the above graph shows, vacancy rates have hit historic lows over the past 2 years and continue to remain significantly below that balanced level as I stand here before you. A critical undersupply of rental properties has compounded the issue. Investors, deterred by rising costs, shifting government policies, regulatory uncertainty, and new property-related taxes are exiting the market. This has resulted in these historically low vacancy rates, leaving our rental community very vulnerable to escalating rents and with very limited choices. Between September 2023 and September 2024, the number of bonds held by the Residential Tenancies Bond Authority reduced by over 24,000. So that's in 12 months. Now, the number of bonds held by the RTBA effectively represents the entire rental housing market in the state. Now, whilst 24,000 might not seem like a massive number, in real world terms, that translates to anywhere between 40,000 and 100,000 fewer bedrooms available today for Victoria's growing rental population. And what do fewer bedrooms translate into? Higher rents. This slide too is now out of date, and the median rental price has hit around $650 per week for the average Australian rental home. I said earlier that the health of the overall system relies on the health of those component parts. The residential rental part of our housing system here in Australia is desperately unhealthy. And this sickness is a product not just of regulation, but ideology. Home ownership is burnt into the Australian psyche, not just as an incredible life achievement, but as a fundamental right. Owning an investment property has been valorised to such an extent that for a large chunk of our population, property has ceased to be thought of as just a home and instead become purely a commodity. Politicians are obsessed with the primacy of home ownership. Over the past 2 days, I've heard both opposition leader Peter Dutton and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese talk about how they're going to get young Australians into their homes. They're constantly talking about ensuring that every Australian can buy themselves a home, but at the same time are seemingly incapable of delivering policies that will realise that ambition. And we're obsessed with it too. I started this presentation with discussion about buying homes, not renting homes. The result of that is a rental system that is an afterthought. A rental system that has been poorly designed and is now trying to be retroactively transformed in order to cope with Australia's growing population of short-term, long-term and lifelong renters. Australian Bureau of Statistics data show that around 30% of Australians live in a rental home at the moment. Let's say around 6 to 7 million people. Now, of that 6 to 7 million people, approximately 60% of them will never own their own home. And that number is increasing year on year. And that growing cohort of Australians, those renters, have to navigate a system and a society that actually considers them second-class citizens. Policy settings are lagging behind market realities. Although tenancy reforms have bolstered renters' rights, a more comprehensive strategy is needed. This strategy must strike a balance between tenant protections and incentives for investors to remain in the market. Additionally, it should stimulate new housing supply with a particular emphasis on social and affordable housing. Now, we were talking about this earlier, but social housing effectively underpins the entire housing system. In the 1950s, Australia built on average more than 15,000 social homes per year. Now, these homes weren't exclusively for the least fortunate or those with the highest needs. They were for teachers, they were for tradies, they were for public servants, nurses and doctors, and for those people within the community that were struggling to keep their head above water. In the 1970s, the number of social homes built by our country or our government reduced to around 10,000 per year. In the 80s and 90s, they continued to drop even further. Since the turn of the century, Australia has constructed on average around 2,000 social homes per year. Now, that's about 13% of what we built in the 1950s. And that's 13% despite the fact that our population is 3 times larger than it was then. around 13% of what we built in the 1950s, despite the fact that our GDP is now 65 times what it was in the 1950s. If we had built social homes at the level that we built them in the 1950s between 2000 and today, we wouldn't be talking about a housing crisis here in this country, because we wouldn't have a housing crisis in this country. And that begs the question, who's responsible? Is it the federal government? And if so, which one? Which one between 1950 and now? Or which combination of governments? Or was it the state governments? And if so, which states and which governments throughout those 70 years? Or is it us, the voters, that have failed to demand more of our political representatives? Us, the voters, who failed to demand that the least fortunate in our society are supported with what is universally considered a human right, and that's adequate housing? Is it us that have failed to recognise that in so doing, we could build the foundations of an equitable and sustainable housing system that will benefit everyone that resides within it, whether you're a renter, an owner-occupier, an investor, or a resident of a social home? I believe that our housing crisis is solvable, and that the leadership required to solve it must come from us, the electorate, the people. We must drive the change and demand that our politicians do more, that they do more quickly, and that they do better. Thank you very much for your time. All good, all good. Yeah.
So I think, look, housing is such a hot topic, and I thought, I did say to Jacob, you've got a minute, but I thought it was just so important that people may have questions there that they'd like to put to Jacob. There is one that came in.
Yes, I saw that.
You might like to address that first and just say what it is. But as Richard moves around and you've got something you want to ask, please, in the normal manner, say who you are and address your question to our speaker. Thank you.
Cheers. So there was an email question in relation to the, are they here? Bulgaria system, which is a form of social housing. Would it work in the Victorian context? I'm not familiar with the other system that was posed in the question. Is the questioner here?
Down the back.
Yep. It was in the UK, a model? The pound brick, yeah. How does that work? Yeah, look, I think, I mean, I've referred to the kind of quantum of social housing that should be in the system. I was up in Sydney recently at a really interesting forum on housing policy, and there was someone that proposed basically social housing should comprise 10% of the total housing system, and the government should introduce that. That would be, they should build at that rate. Effectively, today there's like 11 million dwellings across Australia, so call it an additional 1.1 million dwellings introduced into the system that were social housing and available to those cohorts that I referenced before, not exclusively people that are high needs or struggling financially, but public sector workers, or so it's kind of that hybrid of affordable and social. I 100% think that can work in this system, in this country, in this context, but we need to be able to deliver it, and we need to demand that it is put into the system.
Tony Bettini, 76.8% of residential properties every night have an empty bedroom. The ABS figure is 13 million empty bedrooms every night. If people on the pension could rent out a room and not have to put that as a part of their income.
Yeah, love it. I think Allegra Spender put this, was working on something where effectively pensioners could earn income from renting out their additional bedrooms and not have any impact in terms of not be subject to capital gains tax at the point of sale as well as a result. Fully supported. I think, as every lever pulled will help. I think those numbers are high in terms of 13 million. I've had this conversation with some other people, but they are in the millions without question. And that would go some way to alleviating that. There will only be a subset of a subset of people that will appeal to. But absolutely, if we can get 50,000 people to take up that opportunity, then we're lightening the load on the broader system.
Jim Orchard, just a quick one. I live near Johnson Street, Abbotsford, Collingwood. A lot of new buildings going up, which is great, multi-storey, 10-storey. But a lot of it's working space. It's not houses. Like, how does council or state government, why are we building working space when we've got such a shortage of houses?
It's a great question. Well, part of the, what we're seeing delivered into the market right now was planned a long time ago, pre-COVID in some instances. So a lot of those spaces, they haven't changed their plans, and so they're still delivering office space where there might not be an appetite for it. That said, those areas have a higher occupancy rate than we do have here in the CBD from a commercial perspective as well. There are more people. I just referenced that we've just bought a building on Victoria Street in Abbotsford as well. There's appeal in the suburbs, so people are still going to do that, and they're still going to developers are still going to construct because it's a good return as well. Well, look, the government has introduced a number of policies around quotas within developments over certain price points, over $50 million. There's a requirement for if they exercise some of the planning, fast tracking and red tape cutting options available to them, there are quotas for social and affordable housing to be included in there. And there's, as a result, that'll push out some of the commercial space because it'll become economically better to make those types of decisions.
Let's have a quick one, Richard.
Huge subject. Very good to have you here and great talk. Quick question. How is build to rent going in this state?
Build to rent.
Yeah, it's an emerging housing option. There's quite a lot of build to rent developments and apartments in the pipeline. We should see over the next couple of years somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 15,000 come into the market, which, as long as they come onto the market, and this is the calculus has been changing significantly for a lot of developers over the course of the last 2.5, 3, 4 years. So if they come on into the market, then that'll be a good solution because I think we referenced it earlier on in terms of the ratio of private investors to institutional investors. Now, this is in no way to denigrate private investors, right? But private investors are more susceptible to market variances, to ups and downs in terms of the market and their own personal finances than an institutional investor. So in most markets around the world, it's considered that institutional investors in the property space are better landlords because they're more stable, they're more financially stable, and they're in it for the long term.
Addressing levers.
Yep.
Addressing levers that can be pulled, to what extent has foreign ownership or increase in foreign ownership contributed to the escalation in house prices?
Yeah, well, it definitely has. There's no argument about that, particularly in off the plan. We were having a conversation too again about these empty apartments in buildings. The data around that shows, and the government tracks this pretty closely, that it's probably only about 10% of those properties bought by foreigners that sit there vacant. Apartment banking, land banking, whatever you want to call it. And in the absence of other people actually buying those properties, that's good that they're being occupied and used, particularly in the rental space. But there's no argument that they've helped drive up prices. And I think that governments at both state and federal level have taken measures to try and minimise the impacts that they're having, and we're seeing that play out at the moment.
Righto, everyone. Could we please show a level of appreciation to Jacob? And here's a token of our appreciation, $1 million pair of socks there made by me. Enjoy them.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay, and thank you for coming.